Good morning. Thank you, Summer. Good reading. A favorite author of mine is a man named Wendell Berry. He grew up on a small farm in Kentucky. He went away to university and excelled, eventually became a professor at New York University. At the age of 30, he left that prestigious professorship, left New York to move his family back home to the small Kentucky farm where he was born and raised. Everyone in New York said he was crazy, that he was throwing away his life and his talents. And he's been farming and writing on that small town in Kentucky for the past 60 years. I think he turns 90 this year. He mostly writes about the goodness of small towns and meaningful work, the goodness of family and friendships, and the threats to all of those things from modern forces. And his writings were one of the things that convinced me to move back to my hometown 14 years ago, a decision which we've never regretted. One of Berry's most famous essays explains why he refuses to buy a computer, why he instead has written all of his writings on the same typewriter for the last 60 years. He mentions in this essay, kind of just in passing, that his wife helps him to do much of his proofreading and much of his typing of his manuscripts. And that little detail about his wife's help, it generated more backlash than anything else in the article. Here's one of the mocking letters to the editor that he received. It says this: "Wife, a low-tech, energy-saving device. Drop a pile of handwritten notes on wife and get back a finished manuscript. Wife can also be used to beat rugs and wash clothes by hand, eliminating the need for a vacuum cleaner or a washing machine." I kept thinking of that essay and the response to it as I was reading through Proverbs 31 the last couple of weeks. This remarkable woman of Proverbs 31, what is it that she is most praised for in these verses? Most of the praise for this woman involves what? It's praise for her remarkable, industrious, creative, economic output and work. Over and over, it says that she makes. Here's some verbs from the passage that we just read. She works, she brings, she provides, she buys, she plants, she perceives, she sells, she delivers, she oversees, she makes, she makes, she makes. She's a dynamo of creative productivity and economic output. She's turned her home into a powerhouse of industry and creation, and I don't think we can avoid the creation of wealth. I'm not talking about prosperity gospel. This is not wealth to be luxuriously spent on herself or even just on her children. It's wealth generated for the well-being, for the shalom of her community. Again, what's the main trait for which she is most praised in this passage? Let's look to begin at verses 13 through 19. It's just a sampling. It says, verse 13, "She seeks wool and flax and works with willing hands." Verse 14, "She's like the ships of the merchant. She brings her food from afar." Verse 15, "She rises while it's yet night and provides food for her household and portions for her maidens." Verse 16, "She considers a field and buys it. With the fruit of her hands, she plants a vineyard." Verse 17, "She dresses herself with strength and makes her arms strong. Verse 18, she perceives that her merchandise is profitable. Her lamp doesn't go out at night. Verse 19, she puts her hands to the distaff and her hands hold the spindle. This is an unbelievably industrious person. If you were here last week, you heard Zeke explain how he and I, unbeknownst to each other, were each working on this same passage from Proverbs 31. When I was looking for a passage from Proverbs to talk about this morning, I thought, this was a couple weeks ago before my daughter's wedding, I thought, I don't really want to preach on Proverbs 31. And then preparing for my daughter's wedding, this passage just kept coming back to my mind, and I thought, well, nobody else is going to attempt to preach from Proverbs 31, so maybe I'll just give it a try. And then, of course, I find out that Zeke has already been working on the same passage. But I'd been working on it from a slightly different angle than he had been approaching it. And the biblical text is so rich and deep and layered that you really could mine any passage probably for weeks. And so we're gonna mine this vein a little bit further this week. I really think that this passage in Proverbs 31 speaks to some serious dysfunctions in our modern culture, dysfunctions that show up in that letter to the editor that I read, dysfunctions in the relationship between men and women, in the relationship between work and family and home and community, all things which we see disintegrating all around us. Let's get back to the text. These descriptions of her work continue. Verse 22 says she makes bed coverings for herself and she makes clothing. Verse 24, she makes linen garments and sells them. She delivers sashes to the merchant. Verse 27, she looks well. She oversees the ways of her household and does not eat the bread of idleness. She does not eat the bread of idleness. No kidding. The final verse in this chapter, actually the final verse in the whole book of Proverbs, is verse 31. It speaks of the fruit or the produce of her hands. It says, let her works praise her in the gates. That is, in her community, she's known and admired for her work. When does she sleep? We don't know. Apparently she doesn't. I suspect there's some here this morning who even find this woman slightly annoying or slightly threatening. She's making the rest of us look bad. As Zeke mentioned last week, this woman is an ideal, right? She's a composite. I'm not sure any one human being could actually do all of the things that this woman does. She's mastered the production of textiles, of fabric. In verse 13, it says she seeks wool and flax. Wool is used for clothing, of course. Flax is a plant-based fiber used to make fabric. In verse 14, she's engaged in the import-export business and in international shipping and trade. It says, like the ships of the merchant, she brings her food from afar. Verse 15, she's an amazing chef, apparently works the night shift. She rises while it's yet night and provides food for her household. Verse 16, she's a real estate expert. She considers a field and buys it. And she's an agricultural expert. She plants a vineyard with her hands. Verse 17, she's physically fit from all this work. She makes her arms strong. She doesn't need to spend $50 a month on a gym membership. She doesn't have time to go to the gym. Verse 18, she's an expert in evaluating the value of merchandise, of setting the prices on goods. It says she perceives that her merchandise is profitable. So she's financially savvy. Verse 19, she's mastered the art of the spinning wheel and the loom, that is, of manufacturing clothes. So she puts her hands to the distaff and her hands hold the spindle. These are tools for making thread and for making fabric. She gets up while it's still dark. She burns her lamp late into the night. Nobody can actually do all this. She's an ideal. She's kind of like some of the women on Instagram that my wife follows, I think, right? She's perfect. I think that we modern people, if we're not grounded in a biblical view of this passage, in a biblical view of the world, we're going to tend to read this passage in one of at least two different ways. One, we might read this passage and all that this woman does, all that she's capable of, and think, girl power, right? Anything boys can do, girls can do better. Like girl boss, right? A certain feminist reading of Proverbs 31. Leah Labresco was a young woman, an atheist who converted to Christianity, and she writes this. She says, modern society views women as essentially defective men. So the more that a woman can prove that she's identical to a man, the better. That's where her significance comes from. The more she can shed the hindrances that keep her from functioning just like a man, things like pregnancy and childbirth and nursing and caring for children, the more that she can shed those things, the more she can work exactly like a man, the better. There's a second, also unhelpful approach to this text. It's sort of a mirror image, sort of an opposite of the first approach, and that would be to say, see, this passage shows that women should stay where they belong, in the kitchen, right? They should never work outside the home. Now you see why pastors wouldn't really want to preach on this passage, right? But I believe that Proverbs 31 shows us actually a better way, an altogether different portrait of womanhood and of masculinity and of work and the family home and of relationships between men and women and children and their communities. The first misreading of this passage, the girl power one, what's wrong with that reading? This is clearly a woman in Proverbs 31 who's unbelievably capable. Right? There's no question about that. But what is it that makes her different? She's not on a quest for individual self-expression. Right? She's not on a mission for self-assertion, for self-enrichment. Our culture tells men and women both, put yourself and your ambitions and your advancement above everything else. Right? This woman, by contrast, she remains vitally connected through her work. She's connected to God. She's connected to her family, to her community. She's not asserting her own self-driven agenda. It's not the triumph of her own individual self over and against everyone around her. Her family is not a drag on her. Her children are not a burden. They're actually a source of joy and of praise. There's real mutual help, mutual honoring in this picture. In fact, the whole chapter begins in verse 1 with the instructions of a wise mother to her son about finding a wife. Verse 1 says, it's an oracle that his mother taught him. It's instructions from a mother to her son about finding a wife. And these relationships in this chapter between women and men, they're not competitive. They're mutual. They're interwoven. They bless one another. Verse 11 says, the heart of her husband trusts in her. This is an elaborate dance of mutual blessing and work and creative making and relational connection Verse 28 says, her children rise up and call her blessed, her husband also, and he praises her. Zeke pointed out last week that this it's a poem, this passage. It's a complete poem, and it's structured as, the technical word is a chiasm, but what that basically means is the first line of the poem is a mirror image of the last line, and the second line mirrors the second to the last line, and the third line images the third, all the way until you get to the very center of the poem. And the heart of the poem is actually verse 23, which says, her husband is known in the gates when he sits among the elders of the land. And you might think, of course, this poem is about men. It's always about men, right? But actually, it's way more complex and interesting than that. The chapter begins with the teachings of a wise woman and the Queen Mother, and how does it end? With the praise of this woman by her husband and her children and the community. Verse 28 says, her children rise up and call her blessed. Her husband also praises her. And then I just noticed this, I think 2 days ago. I'd probably read this passage 40 times in the last month, and I just noticed this 2 days ago. Check this out, it's really cool. Verse 31, the last verse of the whole thing, it says, give her the fruit of her hands, and let her works praise her in the gates. Let her work praise her in the gates. What is the center verse of the poem? Verse 23, what does it say? It says, her husband is known in the gates. What's the big deal about gates? Well, the city gates in ancient times were the place where the city leaders met to discuss and decide city business, right? This is the courthouse. This is City Hall, where the important work of the community gets decided. So this man, in verse 23, has an important position of leadership in the community. It's clear he would not have this position of leadership without his amazing wife. But then, verse 31, the capstone verse, it says this woman is publicly praised, recognized, where? In those exact same city gates. So you have to picture this almost visually. The chiasm effect of this poem, the man is nested inside the center of this. He wouldn't be who he is without his wife. But the man and his children are also praising her publicly. This is a mutual blessing. And that mutual blessing overflows to the children and to the community. It's like the man's honor is nested inside the woman's honor, and her honor is nested inside the man's honor. It's all woven together. It almost has a whiff of what? Of Eden, right? You knew we were going to go back to this eventually, right? Genesis 1 and 2. God, in Genesis 2, creates the woman out of the side of Adam and presents her to Adam. And what does Adam say? This is Genesis 2:23. He says, "This at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman because she was taken out of man." So the woman is created out of the side, out of the middle of the man. And every man in this room was born out of the middle of a woman, right? Men and women are interdependent. Neither of us can live without the other, right? By God's design. And in Genesis, the man and the woman who both together image the glory of God, they're given good work to do. A lot of that work looks a lot like this work in Proverbs 31. So this is an Eden marriage, an Eden woman in Proverbs 31. And some of you are thinking, this relationship in Proverbs 31 between this man and this woman and their children, it's a long, long way from my personal experience. Right? I'm a long, long way from Eden. Our society is a long, long way from Eden. We find ourselves in a nasty world with a lot of competition, not that different from Genesis 3, right? What happens in Genesis 3? Sin enters the world, and the very next thing, Adam is saying, God, this woman you gave me, it's her fault, right? After Eden, men and women are pitted against one another in a zero-sum game. If he gets more, she gets less, and vice versa, right? If a mother truly gets her autonomy, truly gets her self-actualization, children are going to be a threat to that. If the man is absolutely free in the modern sense, then his perfect world is a one-night stand with no consequences. Right? If the woman is totally free in the modern sense, then she too, she can visit a clinic, shed the consequences, just like the man walks away from the consequences. Right? Everything gets sacrificed on the altar of absolute freedom and self-assertion and self-actualization, even babies. A certain type of feminism says to the woman, you better get yours. And a certain type of fundamentalism says to the woman, be quiet and stay in your place. All right, both of those really harmful ideas, they come from a place of fragmentation and competition, where the broken pieces are in competition with each other. And practically speaking, our marriages often are approached basically from a stance of competition, right? Even Sandy and I at times, sometimes we're in competition with each other. Are you pulling your weight? Well, are you pulling your weight? I did this. Did you do that? Like, how often does every marriage get caught up in that, right? And we have massive cultural forces pulling us apart, pitting men and women against one another. We all live after this massive world-changing event called the Industrial Revolution. What's the Industrial Revolution? In the year 1800, your great-great-great-grandmother and mine probably lived on a farm where they likely grew most of their own food, likely made most of their own clothing, like this woman of Proverbs 31. Or in 1800, if you weren't a farmer, you were probably a craftsman, probably a maker of something like wheels or barrels or rope or furniture. In any case, your shop would have been attached to your home. Mothers and fathers and children all working together out of the home to support the home. The world of 1800 prior to the Industrial Revolution would have been totally recognizable to the woman of Proverbs 31, almost unrecognizable today. After the Industrial Revolution, most people moved from small towns or farms to the cities. They moved from home-based work to factory-based work. The exodus of the home, it began with men who went away to work in steel mills and coal mines, factories, building things like cars, which took people farther and farther away from their homes. And most people today, instead of providing for their own needs, we buy things in a store, right? Most people no longer work primarily from home. We don't provide for most of our basic needs at home. The Industrial Revolution pulled both men and women away from a stable core of healthy families and healthy communities. It wants to take this woman of Proverbs 31, this highly skilled, highly intelligent, highly honored woman, and send her off to a factory assembly line where she can punch the same 4 holes in the same piece of metal day after day, year after year, and then call that liberation, right? Because now she's doing the same drudgery for a company that her husband does. Wendell Berry writes that despite their masculine heroes of sports or war or the Old West, most men are now entirely accustomed to currying the favor of their bosses. Because of this, many men hate their jobs, but they do as they're told. They're more compliant than most housewives have ever been. They've surrendered to the loss of skilled labor and craftsmanship, the loss of home-based employment, to the falling apart of their families and their communities. Barry says these men are helpless to do anything without money, and so, for money, they do whatever they're told. And modern feminism says, well, we can't exclude women from that system. Our problem is not just men exploiting women. It's a greater problem that both men and women submit to a system that removes any meaningful economic production from the home and makes us dependent on corporations who don't give a rip about families or communities. And children need meaningful work that contributes to the welfare of the home. It's no wonder we give kids screens and send them off to their room. It's no wonder we have record rates of depression in children. If we don't give them something meaningful that they can do that contributes to the good of the home. So these modern prejudices about men and women and work and the home, they deny 2 realities that we see in Proverbs 31. They deny the possibility of marriage as a relationship of mutual help, of men and women working together and actually enjoying the work. And it denies the Proverbs 31 reality of the household as its own economy, a home that's self-reliant in the best sense for its own needs. This week I got to visit Shirley Grieving for a little while, and we were talking about this exact topic, and she described how she and Leland, when they were raising their family, they worked together every day on the farm, and their kids worked with them. Everyone was pulling in harness. Everybody was pulling in the same direction for the good of the home. And the good of the home was not pitted against the good of other homes or the community. These are the kind of homes and households that make for stable communities. Instead, modern marriage is now viewed as an arrangement between 2 individuals, each focused on their own private happiness, 2 perhaps separate careers. They come home and sleep in the same bed. They each assume responsibility for their own sexual satisfaction. But the rights of each individual must be constantly defended, constantly protected against the other. The modern home is a place where 2 individuals will consume large quantities of goods purchased at Walmart or on Amazon and consume one another. If the Chinese-made product that I ordered on Amazon disappoints, I can send it back. And if my spouse fails to make me sufficiently happy, I can send her back to where she came from too. right? Proverbs 31 describes something entirely different altogether. Something that's almost hard for us to imagine. That is a marriage and a home where the husband and the wife and the children too are mutually serving one another. They're all working together for the glory of God and for the good of the family and the community. And some people might say, oh, you just want to go back to Little House on the Prairie, right? This is unrealistic. The Industrial Revolution happened. Genesis 3 happened. You can't go back to Eden. You can't turn back the clock. Here's a happier thought, and out of Proverbs 31, that there are many couples, many families in this church who are pushing back against the modern superstitions of progress. In this room, there's countless examples of families who do work together, families who either own their own business and the husband and the wife work fully engaged in meaningful, productive work, satisfying work that benefits their home and their community. Farm families, yes, but also families who are self-employed in the trades, perhaps, in construction or plumbing or electrical work. Young men and women in this church don't have to look very far to see examples of families who are pulling together, generating good work, good things for the community. And please don't hear me wrong. I'm not saying that men or women, either one, shouldn't be employed by another company outside the home. My wife works often 2 days a week outside the home for someone else's business. It actually happens to be a home-based business, but my daughter starts her first job next week as a nurse working for a hospital. So I'm not trying to tell you how much a man or a woman should work outside the home for someone else. Clearly, this woman in Proverbs 31 has tasks that are described that take her outside of her home to work. What I'm talking about is an approach or a commitment that by God's grace fights back against the forces, the centrifugal forces that want to pull families apart. And it really does require intentionality if we're going to resist those separating forces. And by God's grace, forge the kind of stable homes and families and communities that we see pictured in Proverbs 31. And I know there are single moms here this morning who have to go to work to provide for their families. There are men who have to go to jobs that they don't love because they're taking care of people that they do love. We have people in this church who are called to singleness. We have widows and widowers who might look longingly on this passage as if they're on the outside of it. But they're not on the outside of it. You don't have to be married to be a Proverbs 31 woman or a Proverbs 31 person. A person who works for the shalom, for the well-being of their community. We have single men and women doing exactly that, who are deeply invested in the people around them. We're a long way from Eden. Proverbs 31, verse 20 acknowledges this. Verse 20 sees those in the community who have taken it on the chin. It says, she opens her hand to the poor and reaches out her hands to the needy. These are realities that we see all around us too, right? The home described in Proverbs 31 is not a It's not a selfish, inward-looking home. It's not tribal. We don't have to look very far, even in our town, to find people whose homes and families have been torn apart by societal forces inside and outside. The church, the family, the household of God, has to be at work restoring lives and families and homes and children and women and men, and restoring meaningful work for the glory of God. And even though we find ourselves a long way from Eden, there is a wedding feast at the end of history to which all of God's people are invited through faith. The perfect husband, the perfect groom, Jesus, with his united to his perfected bride. That's the hope to which we aspire, and that's the model to which we aspire. Let's pray. Father, we thank you that amidst the brokenness we see around us, the brokenness we see inside of us, all the ways that we know we fall short of the glory of God, we fall short of the goodness of your word. We thank you that you continue to come and meet us and rescue us and help us. I pray that you would continue that work of restoring homes and families and men and women and children in this community, restoring us to yourself and to one another. And we ask you to help us for Jesus' sake. Amen.